stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about strangers mostly do ask questions about old Eccles, said the landlord, and there was a suggestion in his tone that he had lots of information to give. Then you are suddenly aware of being watched by an old fellow who looks like a startled rabbit. Eccles' daughter, a very beautiful woman, and her clothes cost money. Eccles cobbles, and cobbles very well, but you don't grow rich cobbling. So why is this cobbler so scared, and where did the money come from? The Cobbler. By Percy James Brebner. Published May 7, 1927. Strangers mostly do ask questions about old Eccles, said the landlord, and there was a suggestion in his tone that he had lots of information to give. Certainly he does look queer sitting at that window of his, cobbling. It's the house that strikes you first, returned the stranger. You come upon it so unexpectedly at the turn of the road, it is so forlorn and isolated in that ring of great elms, and then you are suddenly aware of being watched by an old fellow who looks like a startled rabbit. You're right, that does describe him. It never struck me before. Perhaps it is fear which makes him watch everyone who comes along the road to the village, the stranger suggested. It's the other way about, was the answer. Folk are more afraid of him than he of them. I went about the world a bit before I settled down to innkeeping, but they're superstitious hereabouts, believers in old tales. In the hills round there are places with such names as the Devil's Leap, the Witch's Cave, and such like, all with stories attached to them, which the folk here swallow whole. You won't find anyone anxious to go out to Eccles after dark. Do they imagine he has sold himself to the devil? They don't get definite like that. You see, that house was tumbling to pieces, and said to be haunted, when Eccles came over 20 years ago, and I'm told, I wasn't here at the time, but he was warned not to go there, and, of course, when he took no notice of the warning, was at once put down as queer. That's how tales get about, and often there's nothing more in them than that, but in Eccles' case. The landlord stopped short and nodded towards the open door. A girl was passing, a girl who could hardly have passed unnoticed anywhere, and in this out-of-the-way village on the Welsh border, was remarkable indeed. She walked with a grace which had something in it akin to the wild, untrammeled life of hill and moorland. She was beautiful, radiant, hair and eyes, cheek and lips, lavishly touched with nature's most perfect pigments. That's Eccles' daughter, said the landlord. That rabbit her father, exclaimed the stranger. Then surely her mother must have been a very beautiful woman. Can't say, don't suppose anyone can, because Eccles wasn't bred in these parts, and his wife was dead when he came, must have just died, because Judith was a baby. For a time there was a woman Eccles brought with him to look after her, but Eccles soon began to look after her himself, and the woman departed. They say old Eccles worships his daughter. I don't wonder, said the stranger. What does astonish me is that all the young fellows don't crowd out to that bend in the road whenever they get the chance. They're as scared of her as of her father, that's why. She's more standoffish with them than Squire's daughter. Squire's daughter they can understand, but Judith, no, so they explain it by saying that Eccles worships her because she is a bit more than human. That's another tale that has got about. Evidently Eccles is not the only queer person about here, laughed the stranger. The landlord was silent for a few moments, as if he were wondering whether there was anything personal in the remark. He was not an adept at telling a story, he was a long time in coming to the point, and the passing of Judith had interrupted the natural course of his narrative. They talk a lot of nonsense. I know, he went on, filling his pipe deliberately, giving himself time to collect his thoughts, but, well, did you happen to notice her clothes? No. Eccles cobbles, and cobbles very well, but you don't grow rich cobbling, and her clothes cost money. That is what I was coming to when she passed. They say Eccles is a miser. Would he spend money on clothes if he were? To be sure I hadn't thought of it that way, but there's reason besides Judith's clothes for the story. Eccles must have spent a lot of money putting that tumble-down house to rights. I've heard the roof was that bad it wouldn't have done you much good taking shelter under it from a shower. Old Jenkins, the carpenter, told me that he said it was surprising the bolts and bars Eccles had put on doors and shutters, that stout they'd keep any thieves outside. I never heard that a cobbler had much about him in an ordinary way to attract thieves. The bolts and bars are suspicions, certainly, said the stranger. The sight of the girl had interested him in the story. That's the way I look upon it, said the landlord, lighting his pipe, and there's more than that. Did I tell you I came here 10 years ago? You didn't say how long, you only said Eccles was here before you. 10 years ago I came, or is it only 9, now? I'm a bad hand at remembering, and I can't be sure without looking up my papers, and, anyway, it don't signify. It don't alter what I'm going to tell you. I hadn't been here more than a matter of weeks when Eccles comes along, and, waiting until he gets me alone, begins talking about my being a bit of a traveler. I wasn't against yarning about my experiences. I spent some years at sea. You know, and he listened as if he was taking it all in, until he suddenly interrupts by asking if I'd ever come across a man called, the name has slipped clean out of my mind, but I'd never heard it, anyway. All Eccles wanted to know was whether I'd heard of that man. He wasn't interested in anything else I could tell him. Queer, wasn't it? Did you ever find out anything more? The stranger asked. I'm not sure. Some summers back there was a fellow came through the village with a gypsy van, although he wasn't a gypsy, at least he said he wasn't. I let him put his van on that bit of land of mine across the road there, and we had some talks here in the evening. Interesting chap he was, and knew the country for miles round like the back of his hand. He knew nothing about Eccles, but he had heard the name of the man Eccles asked me about. Queer name it was, one you wouldn't be likely to forget, although I have. This gypsy chap was somewhere near Worcester when he heard that a man of this name had nearly been killed, or had nearly killed somebody. He didn't know which way it was, but there was a lot of excitement about it in the place, and the gypsies' trade was spoilt that trip in consequence. Was there a woman in the story? Asked the stranger. Exactly what I asked him, but he didn't know. Eccles doesn't impress me as the kind of man any woman would trouble herself much about. It is always difficult to tell what a woman will do, said the stranger, sententiously. You have interested me in Eccles, and during my few days' stay here I expect I shall find time to get as far as the bend of the road once or twice. The stranger was past his first youth, well past it, had lived long enough to impress his name on that part of the world interested in geology, was in fact in the neighborhood to examine officially certain strata in the surrounding hills, but he was not too old to be attracted by a pretty woman. Geological strata were temporarily forgotten in his desire to see Judith Eccles again, and he came to the conclusion that a pair of shoes he had with him might be improved by cobbling. Next morning he took them down to the house at the bend of the road. From the window Eccles watched him approach, and when he entered, looked more like a startled rabbit than ever. Not much the matter with these, he said, after looking at the shoes. They are good for a lot of work yet. Not for my work, the stranger answered. I have got to climb about your hills for the next few days, amongst the pits, and stone heaps, and stream beds, after geological specimens. So you want these strengthening a bit? Exactly. They'll be ready tomorrow morning, said Eccles. Geology doesn't interest you, I suppose? Said the stranger, in an endeavor to keep the conversation alive. Not a bit. It takes a man about, very likely, but, then, I'm best pleased to stay where I am. I don't wonder. It is a picturesque spot. Is it? I haven't much time to look at it, and Eccles turned to his bench by the window. Had the stranger known the name of the man in whom the cobbler was interested, he would have mentioned it casually and watched the effect. As it was, he had no excuse for staying, and left without a glimpse of the daughter, marveling more than ever that such a man could have such a daughter. Yet Eccles interested him, too. There was a certain refinement in his voice which suggested that he might not always have been a cobbler. Judy. Judy. Eccles called, directly the stranger had gone. And when the girl came, he went on excitedly. Did you see that man? Just caught sight of him from behind the blind, the girl answered. He is a stranger, staying at the inn. I saw him talking to the landlord yesterday. Asking questions about me, I'll warrant. Nonsense, father. Look at those shoes, Judy, he said, snatching them up from the bench and holding them out to her. What is the matter with them? Nothing, as far as I can see. There you are. He brought them, to be mended. Just an excuse. He is a spy sent to ferret me out. I don't believe. What you believe doesn't matter, Judy, it is what I know. Somewhere my enemy is lurking, ready to pounce upon me unawares. I have felt him near, very near, lately, and the coming of the stranger. We'll lock and bar the house early tonight, Judy. The girl nodded. This attitude of her father's was no new thing to her. Experience had taught her how to treat him, but she speculated whether he was not a little worse than usual, and vaguely thought of the stranger. She must look more closely at him when he came for his shoes. Before dusk the house at the bend of the road was shuttered and barred. It looked dismal and forlorn in its ring of overshadowing elms when the stranger walked past it in the early evening, looked lifeless, not a ray of light visible from any chink or hole in a shutter. It was a strange setting for such virility and beauty as Judith Eccles possessed. Within, the girl had to use all her persuasion to make her father eat his evening meal. He only wanted to talk, as was always the case when excitement was upon him. She knew all he would say, the exact words. He never varied, the tale was always the same in every detail. She had heard it scores and scores of times, yet she sat patiently, if a little contemptuously, and let him talk. It was the only way to treat him. I am afraid of him, always was, Eccles said, as if he were telling the story for the first time. You see how thin and small I am, and he is big, with a big laugh, a big voice, big every way, except one. His brain is small. For a long time I did not see how small it was, not until I loved your mother and had him for a rival. Her beauty made me brave and cunning. I made money out of him, cheated him, he said, but that was only because I was sharper than he was. Your mother, Judy, was important, the daughter of good people, who looked upon this man as worthy of her, but would not look at me at all until I made them by persuading your mother to marry me secretly. Then this man nearly killed me, would he have done had not the police come just in time. He swore he would kill me some day, when he found me alone, when there was no one to protect me. While your mother lived I thought I was safe, but she died when you were born, and then I came here. He hasn't found me, but he will. I have always known that. He will kill me if he can, that is why I am always prepared, that is why the bolts and bars here are so strong. Oh, yes, I am prepared. Here the story usually ended, but tonight her father did not suddenly lapse into silence. I am more afraid now, he went on in a whisper, leaning across the table towards his daughter. The coming of this stranger means the end, but I am more prepared. If bolts and bars fail, then, see, Judith. I have fitted a sheath inside my sleeve to hold it. From his sleeve he drew a long, thin-bladed knife, sharp-pointed, keen of edge, a knife fashioned for cutting leather, but now set apart for another purpose. The girl looked at it without flinching, horrified, yet keeping her self-control. Have you made that sheath only today, just because that stranger came? She asked. No, days ago. I have felt the end approaching, his coming only convinced me there was reason in my fear. Geology. He said he was here for geology. He thinks me a fool. He put away the knife, and became less excited, but Judith watched him furtively. Her father had certainly gone a step farther. She must look closely at this stranger tomorrow when he came for his shoes, it might be necessary to warn him. Go to bed early, Judy, Eccles said, getting up from the table. I shall play for a while. I will light your lamp for you, she said, and went to a small, bare room which had so thin a slip of a window that the leanest of men could not have forced his way through it. Daylight was of no consequence in this room, it was never used in the day. The furniture consisted of a stout table and chair, and in the corner was an iron-bound oak chest. The stone floor was innocent of covering, and a lamp hung over the table from a hook in the ceiling. Judith's nerves were a little on edge tonight. She started as she opened the door sharply, for an old greatcoat, hanging behind it, slithered on the rough wood, with a suggestion that someone, who was hiding there, had moved. She lighted the lamp, and tried the lid of the oak chest, which was locked. She thought her father kept his playthings there. Eccles went all round the house to satisfy himself that every window was secure, every bar in place and bolts shot home, before he entered this room and locked himself in. He did not go to the oak chest, but removed the back of the fireplace, which looked solid, and took out a box which was concealed there. From the leather bags it contained he emptied gold upon the table. It was not a fabulous sum, but it was much for a cobbler to possess. Perhaps the greater part of it had been obtained from his rival, who, as he had told Judith, had accused him of cheating. So he played, letting the gold run through his fingers, dividing it into little heaps, stacking the coins into piles, talking to them, and laughing at them as if they were sentient things. He heard no sound but the soft ring of the coins as he played with them, yet outside the door, in stocking feet, Judith listened. Although she knew nothing about the box concealed in the fireplace, she knew what her father played with. She had seen him once, before he had had a better shutter put on the slip of window, and from time to time since then she had made him give her money. She had not threatened him, but she made it clear that he must sacrifice something if he would keep his secret. Tonight she was a little afraid. Perhaps it was the sight of the knife which had frightened her, and she did not beat a hasty retreat to her room until her father's playing was over. Eccles was the ordinary, startled-looking cobbler next day when the stranger called for his shoes. "Just what I wanted," the stranger said, after examining them. "I had a tramp round yesterday. Very interesting country." "I have heard others say so," returned the cobbler. "You ought to tramp about yourself sometimes. It would do you good after so many hours at your bench. I wonder your daughter doesn't persuade you." "Had I such a daughter, I should want to walk about with her sometimes," and the stranger laughed, hoping to make the old man communicative. "I can't waste time talking about her," said Eccles. "For the matter of that, I do as I like, so does she, and I can't call to mind that I've noticed her tramping about with anybody. I suppose she doesn't care about it any more than I do." The stranger had to admit that he had spent money on cobbling for nothing, and laughed to hide his annoyance as he went out. Then Judith joined her father, and laughed too. "You see how it is," she said, "he's just trying to get acquainted with me. That's why he brought those shoes, thought he'd be able to drop in any time and talk to you, and so get to know me. He is just like the rest of them." "Oh, no, he's different." "He is a gentleman," said Eccles. "The man to attract me will have to be very different," said Judith self-complacently, and her proud young beauty seemed to make the speech natural. "At any rate, he is not a spy. Had I been ugly, he wouldn't have brought those shoes to be cobbled." Eccles turned to his bench with a gesture of irritation, and if Judith imagined she had reassured him, she was mistaken. He would have the house shut and barred that night even before dusk had fallen, and was more excited and nervous than ever. Judith went to her room, but not to sleep. Like every other window in the house, hers was shuttered, and the room was hot and depressing. Certainly her father was worse than she had ever known him. Tonight at supper he had felt his sleeve every few seconds to make sure the knife was there. Was she quite safe in this house alone with her father? She had often asked herself why she stayed there, but fear had not touched her before. How much of the oft-repeated story was true? She had no certain knowledge that any of it was true, yet she was so different from other girls in the village, it was easy to believe her mother had been of importance. Why had she married such a man as her father? Judith had left her door open, and suddenly she started up, listening keenly. The moment before the house had been utterly silent, now there had come a sharp sound, the opening of a shutter, perhaps, or the falling of a bar from a door, then a voice, high-pitched with excitement, her father's. As she scurried down the stairs and along the passage there were blows, and distinct words. "I was ready. You didn't expect that, I've been waiting. Bolts couldn't keep you out, but we settle things my way." Between each sentence came a thud, a strange sound, something deadly in it, and chuckling laughter of intense satisfaction. "Father! Father!" Judith called, hammering upon the door. "There's no escape," Eccles cried, and there was another thud which ended with a splitting sound. "Father! Father!" There was no answer, no sudden silence at her call. The chuckling continued, sharp words, half-finished sentences, punctuated by blows. Who was with her father? How had he got in? The stranger. That knife. The awful possibilities steadied Judith's nerves which, for a moment, seemed to be slipping beyond her control. Hastily she unfastened the back door. Could anyone have got in through that slip of a window? No, it was dark, shuttered, not a chink through which she could see into the room. The little world in that circle of elms was horribly still, and she was suddenly afraid of the house, afraid to enter it again. The stranger at the inn had said good night to the landlord, and was halfway up the stairs when the sharp knocking came at the door. The landlord's exclamation, and his momentary inability to move, showed he was not so free from superstition as he had declared. "What is wrong, I wonder?" said the stranger, coming down the stairs again, and the landlord, finding comfort in companionship, went to the door. "Judith Eccles. I want you to come at once. I think father is killing somebody." She did not speak to the stranger, but it was he who took the initiative, who asked questions as they hurried down the road, who peremptorily commanded Eccles to open the door, and when his demand was only answered by meaningless words and chuckling, rummaged the cobbler's shop for some means of forcing the door. It was a stout door, securely fastened, but the landlord was a powerful man, and with strong blows and the leverage of an iron bar, forced it open at last. "Carefully," Judith whispered. "He has a knife." "He's dead." "You're too late," Eccles cried. "He hid behind the door waiting for me, but I ready, look." And he pointed to the knife which was sticking through the greatcoat into the door, then laughed with mad satisfaction. The coat was cut and slashed in a score of places. The hallucination that the coat was the man he feared must have come suddenly, for Eccles had begun his night's play. The contents of some of the leather bags had been poured onto the table, one, half empty, had been thrown down, and some of the coins were scattered on the floor. The cobbler was quite mad now. He tried to get possession of the knife again, but the landlord prevented him, or he might have done murder in reality. That night they watched him, and the next day he was taken away. The stranger was very useful to Judith Eccles in the days that followed. The oak chest contained papers, not money, as Judith had supposed, and these papers and letters proved that, in the main, the story Eccles had told his daughter was true. Eccles was an assumed name, and although there was nothing to show what his original walk in life had been, it was evident he had only taken to cobbling to conceal his identity the more effectually. Very probably he had cheated Catamol, that was the name the landlord could not remember, and perhaps the thrashing Catamol had given him had started his mental weakness. Why Judith's mother had married him was a mystery. Letters showed that her people were anxious to keep in touch with the child, but the father would have nothing to do with them. "I wish I had known of those papers," said Judith. "I should have gone years ago." "You would have left your father?" asked the stranger. "Why not? Do you think we had anything in common? I have heard that he worshipped you. Feared me, was always afraid that I knew more than I did. I am not a bit like him. I wonder why mother married him. There may have been something attractive about him in those days. But mother was a lady, and father was not always a cobbler," said the stranger. "Well, it doesn't matter, it's over," she said, with a shrug of her shoulders. "What shall you do now?" "Go to my mother's people." The stranger forgot his age, forgot many things, and did his utmost to dissuade her from this course, tried to convince her of a better way, the way of love. She looked at him and laughed. "Love, you, I am going to the life I ought always to have had, out of this horrible existence. The contents of those leather bags will ensure me a welcome. You are a stranger, nothing to me, besides, you are old. I have had no real youth yet, and I mean to have it. One way or another I mean to have it. I have sacrificed enough. I wonder whether you have any idea what the sacrifice has been, and how I hate this place and everyone connected with it. If I marry, I will marry youth. When I leave here, I intend to slam the door on the past, lock it, and throw away the key." Her attitude was hard and uncompromising. The stranger's memory returned, and he became practical. She was beautiful, desirable, her mother's daughter no doubt, but she was also the daughter of a madman. Nothing could alter that. Under all the circumstances, geology was safer than love. A week later, the cobbler died raving, in an asylum. Catamol, it was discovered, had died 15 years ago. The end. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.